Well, a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are tuning in from the world. My name is Adrian Reed, and I'm really pleased that we're joined today by Dr. Alexia Nalewaik, who is Professor of Project Management and of course, a practitioner consultant as well. She has over 25 years of experience in audit, systemic risk, project analytics, process improvement, and process management. She's fellow of RICS Americas, AACE International, the Guild of Project Controls, and ICEC. She's also past president of AACE International and a past chair of ICEC. And probably even more importantly than that, she's just published a new book, Project Cost Recording and Reporting. Now, I was fortunate enough to meet Alexia on Twitter, of all places, through the PM chat hashtag, and I read some of Alexia's, well, your sort of papers really on project-related stuff, and they really resonated with me. So I'm really pleased you're able to come and speak to us today. So with a presentation entitled "Ethical Project Reporting," Alexia, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I know we've been talking a lot about sort of finding synergy between the PM chat group and the BA chat group. So this is definitely one way of doing that. So, as Adrian said, I've just published a book on project reporting, which actually, that is, it was the first book contract I signed, but the second book I wrote. Somehow another book just came out onto the pages first before that one did. So I'm sure my publisher is very happy I finally got that one on paper. They've been very patient. They did not ditch me for having waited several years longer than I should have to put it on paper. But anyway, that's... And they've signed me to a third book contract as well now, so I'm writing my third book.
Fantastic. Sounds like a lot of work, though.
It is a lot of work. Now, this particular book actually stemmed from a paper that I wrote back in 2006, and it just happened at the time that I was auditing a number of clients, and they. One of the most frequent questions that I would receive would be, you know, how do we put reports together? What should we put in a report? And that also tended to be a question that showed up very frequently at conferences and in project management chat rooms. Invariably, every couple months, somebody would post something, a question to a shared group that said, "My client wants me to put together a report. I have no idea what to put in it." And it was asked so frequently. Now, of course, you know, you look at all the buzz around data analytics and visualization. It ties in very nicely with project reporting. It's a sort of a good time to get this book out because all of these synergies are occurring more or less at the same time when we have lots of data and we wish to know how best to present that to stakeholders. So project reports are a preferred method of communication in addition to meetings and other ways of communicating project information, but they're also a necessary part of control and governance on a project. They're part of the project record. Now, there are lots of different kinds of reports, and you'll see sort of this semi-exhaustive list later on in the slides when I share those. But report content is generally determined by what data you have available, what stakeholders you're reporting to, and what their needs are. And then also by the segment or phase of the project that you're in at that particular point in time. So early on in the project, you'll be reporting a lot of forecasts, a lot of talk about you know, your process of planning the project and getting things together. And then in the middle of the project, things get kind of wild and hairy, and you're talking about change and risk and things that didn't go as they should have done, or things that went well, and you know, you're doing your best to cheerlead while at the same time, you know, sort of saying, well, these things didn't go well, but we'll be recovering that, you know. And then at the end, you're wrapping up and presenting a more full picture of what happened on the project. So really, reporting focuses very much on stakeholders. Different stakeholders have different information needs, different perspectives, different depths of understanding. They use different language. They have different objectives regarding the project, different roles. They might even have different definitions of success. So you could have one stakeholder who's just plain happy they're getting a new school. Or you could have another stakeholder at exactly the same time who's the incoming principal of the school, and he just really hates the wall color in the carpet. So at the same time, a project that is a success and a failure depending on who you've asked.
Yeah. And I guess if you overlay the political power plays as well, that's another dimension of
Yes.
goals and objectives as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But most of all, stakeholders want assurance. They want to be told how things are going in general, and they want to receive the data they need in order to be able to act as they need to, make their decisions. So decision makers need information that is meaningful to them, in language they understand, which varies drastically from stakeholder to stakeholder, actionable at their level, and timely enough for them to actually do something about it. So I am at this point going to share my slides. And we can, I'm going to click through to this, because this is the point where it really helps to have the slides rather than just me as a talking head. So project team members have a lot of different responsibilities to project stakeholders. Primary is fiduciary duty, letting stakeholders know what has been spent and how it has been spent. You also have decision making that needs to be done by project stakeholders. You're looking to be fair and include participation from many different stakeholder groups. You need their cooperation. You're being accountable to them, and then there are a lot of other different responsibilities, including the image of the project, risk management, and so forth. So when I say there are lots of stakeholders, here's an example of one particular project. This was a university, several university buildings that were being built on a campus. So you can see, often when we talk about the project team, we're talking about the contractual team. We're talking about the owners, the organizational owners, and then the project management office, consultants, so on and so forth. But there are also financial stakeholders, public stakeholders, governmental entities, and then other interested parties, all of which represent stakeholder groups. Now, as you can imagine, there is no one-size-fits-all report that can suit all stakeholders. They don't all necessarily speak the same language. Some may understand technical terms, others might not. I've certainly had the experience of reporting to citizens oversight committees where I've needed to constantly redefine key project management terms because they're not accustomed to that sort of language. They don't live in that sort of world in their daily life. And they react in very interesting ways to key pieces of information. So the first time you start talking about expenditures in millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions, they freak out a little because they can't imagine anything really over 1,000. So different audiences, have different information needs, different language, different levels of confidentiality. So at the outset of a project, and then as needed throughout the project, your communications plan is a pretty important thing to refer to when you're talking about distributing and communicating information to stakeholders. Timing of reports may depend on scheduled meetings, regularly scheduled meetings, or even sort of impromptu meetings. Format will change depending on the stakeholders, distribution method as well. And then obviously storage and disposal. Public projects will have a retention of records time, as will most projects. So things to consider when you're developing a project are the stakeholders themselves, where they sit on the project, what their role is, what decisions they need to make, and how often they need to receive that information. Also, whether or not you can even access the kind of data that they're looking for. Now, that's also kind of interesting, because your stakeholders might know the sort of information they need, but they don't know what language to use in asking for it. So I have on one construction project, I had a financial person who kept asking for the schedule, an accountant asking for the schedule. They kept being given the project schedule, the timeline, instead of what they really meant was the schedule of values. They were looking for the cost data for the project, and just they experienced sort of this ever increasing level of frustration because they weren't getting what they were asking for, except to the project team they were getting what they were asking for. So it might take a few iterations for stakeholders to find shared language with the team regarding the kind of data that they need to receive. Now, to that end, there are lots of different types of reports. In the book, I discuss almost all of these. In fact, I do discuss all of these. I provide visual examples of them. I discuss the sort of stakeholders that might want to receive different kinds of reports. All sorts of things that can make it easy to discuss with your stakeholders. Okay, here are examples of reports. Is this the sort of thing you're looking for? Or what sort of information do you need? And this is the way it could fit into a report. You're probably, depending on the sort of projects you're working on, you're probably very, very familiar with cost and schedule reports, end of project reports, dashboard reporting. And then if you're working on agile projects, you'll be very familiar with burn down, throughput, cycle time type of reports that you might not see in a more traditional non-agile project. Now, key to reporting is obviously information and data. And there are many, many different sources of data, which can lead to lots of challenges in trying to put together a report. Your primary source, if you have a centralized software system for your project, might be your project controls and project management software. You might also be pulling information from procurement or from finance software, from asset management, contract management, document control, BIM and GIS systems, production management, programming, all sorts of different sources. Not all of these sources might be electronic. Some might be paper. Some might be visual. Some might be handwritten or notes taken from various meetings. So it depends very much on your person who's keeping the records and taking the minutes of meetings. And there are all sorts of challenges with data sources in terms of getting them to play nicely with each other, compare apples to apples in terms of the coding within the systems, often you end up with apples to oranges, which becomes a bit of a project data train wreck. You also might encounter situations where you think you have everything in one system, but you really don't. So I was actually auditing a project where we were pulling, or the project team was pulling most of the information from the project management software. And as an auditor, I came in and looked at their reports and I said, well, you've said the project is this much money, but you're at this % complete, and you're saying you've only spent this much. There's something very wrong in your reporting. It turns out that being a hospital project, the hospital had included all the major hospital equipment, scanners and these sort of things, under the hospital's procurement system and purchasing system. And that was not being pulled into the project reports. It was held by a completely different department in a completely different building, and it wasn't talking to the project management software at all.
Wow, wow.
So they were missing an entire line item of major hospital equipment. So again, having somebody who has the big picture and can look at it and say, you know, your data just doesn't make sense, is sometimes useful. Now we're here today to talk about ethics in reporting, so I'm getting to the meat of this finally. There are a lot of problems and challenges in reporting that can lead to ethical issues. Some are intentional, some are unintentional, and I'm going to discuss both here today. The first challenge is format and content, and I've covered some of that so far. There can be inadvertent ethical issues with the level of detail provided to stakeholders. So providing too little information prevents them from, getting the information they need to make decisions. Too much information, that's a game played by lawyers and project team members with auditors, where you drown them in so much information they just can't get through it. So too much information can also confuse the heck out of a stakeholder. Consistency of reporting is also something. If you're providing a monthly or weekly or bi-weekly report, you want that to be consistent from month to month or period to period, so that your audience doesn't get confused. They always know to look in the top left corner for that piece of data they always need. If you're comparing project to project, you want your project reports to have the same format, so that your stakeholders don't need to hunt all through the report to find the same piece of information if they're trying to compare projects. You want to make sure that project is relevant and necessary. And that could also become important if you have confidentiality issues. Make sure that you're not presenting information that is confidential for perhaps a public report. Public reports are very different from internal reports. And missing information. Missing information is also kind of challenging. You might have developed a project report format that you've been using for a few months, and then due to the project life cycle, you're suddenly facing more risks or more change. That kind of information needs to be incorporated into the report. It may not have existed previously, so the project team needs to be aware that there's a new category available that might be needed on a project report. The project team is, above all things, accountable for what they report, and as a result, accuracy is of the utmost importance. Some of those challenges I mentioned earlier, systems integration and getting data to talk nicely to each other, systems available data, we've discussed already. Some of the other challenges that could lead to ethical issues are the traceability of data, knowing where a piece of information came from. Now, That isn't actually the kind of question that tends to come up when a report is published. That's the annoying kind of question that comes up a year after a report was published. And somebody asks, well, where did that number come from? If your project team has not traced that data and kept copies of the data that went into the report, you won't be able to answer the question. These are the sort of questions that auditors tend to ask, the sort of questions that stakeholders tend to ask when a project has gone off the rails and they're going backwards through reports, asking, well, why was the data, why were these the numbers then and these are the numbers now, and why was there a sudden change? Where did the information come from before? You need to validate the reliability of your sources and the accuracy of your information. Otherwise, your reports could be flat out wrong. They could be incomplete, and that can lead to problems down the road. These are some of the simpler problems. I'm getting into hairier problems later. Stakeholders do want assurance. As a result, they do expect a certain level of transparency. They want to be able to know the background of data, where it came from, how it occurred. More importantly, you also could have a challenge with misuse of reports. Reports are intended for a particular audience. If they are picked up by a different audience, that audience might not understand the report, the purpose of the report. Reports have a tendency to get legs and go places they should not have. And that can become a challenge for the project team, especially if a particular single-use, purpose-built report finds its way elsewhere. It can actually be used against the project team, especially if that report, being purpose-built, did not contain certain information. It could have been purely a cost report or purely a schedule report. And if found by a third party, and if perhaps it has been given to the public or received by even a different department, they might start asking questions about, well, why isn't this or that in this report, and start making accusations that the project team has somehow been unethical or ineffective, when in fact they're looking at one of perhaps dozens of reports, and the report they really want that has what they consider to be the necessary information that might exist. It just not might exist in the report they're looking at. So misuse of reports can be a challenge, and my only suggestion for that is to talk with your various stakeholders about confidentiality of reports and appropriateness of reports. And if your project is big enough and newsworthy enough, it might help to have lists of stakeholders and categories of stakeholders, and have a list of different reports that are appropriate for those different types of stakeholders. You'll find that public reports to the general public tend to be very succinct. They contain a lot of photos. They talk a lot about the status of the project and the future impact of the project. They tend to have a lot of spin and be very, very positive. If they do mention any challenges on projects, or if the media has picked up on certain things, there will be a certain amount of optimism typically in those public reports. Whereas internal reports to a very specific executive team may be considerably more transparent about challenges and problems that the project is attempting to overcome. So here we get into the hairier kind of problems that definitely can become ethical issues. Timeliness is a challenge on reports. I have certainly been on projects of my own where information did not make it into the project management system because the information was provided on paper to a particular team member, and that piece of paper was sitting on their desk or put in a drawer and they went on holiday and it didn't get put in the system, and therefore your project information was incorrect. Late data is not useful to anybody. On the other hand, I've also seen situations where the project team is cranking through trying to get data in and the report's late. Again, if the report's late, that's not useful to anybody either, because a late report means that the report wasn't available at a particular scheduled meeting, or a decision might not have been able to be made in a timely fashion. One thing that we don't often talk about that needs to be talked about are data cutoff dates. So if you're dealing with different systems in different departments, some information from contractors, some from the owner, some from the project team, cutoff dates could be weekly. They might be always on a Friday, or they might go by calendar days. End of the month, 1st of the month, 15th of the month. So there may be differences between the way project management systems are treated and the way procurement or financial systems treat data. It could mean when you're assembling a project report that your data is always 15 days out of date, or a certain number of days out of date due to the cutoff dates of a particular department or software system. So this is something you need to be aware of when you're working between systems and trying to gather data for project purposes. It's something you need to talk to the team about and see if there are ways to do interim updates to data, even if the cutoff dates don't normally suit. Another issue is the difference between passive reporting and active reporting. A lot of what is presented is passive reporting. You're reporting on what has happened, on information, perhaps amounts of financial amounts that have been spent, safety incidents that have occurred. It's all very passive. It's all very retrospective. That isn't necessary. That's necessary and useful to certain kinds of clients. It's useful to institutional clients and internal clients that just want to know how things are going. That's usually useful to public stakeholders. So that's the sort of thing that's presented to the public. But stakeholders that are very active in the project, stakeholders that have a role to play in terms of decisions to be made and their own stakeholders that they need to liaise with, are really looking for more active reporting. Now, active reporting is forecasting, looking at what could occur or what is expected to occur that may be different from what had been planned. So we're talking about forecasted change in cost or changes to the program or schedule. We're talking about risks. We're talking about mitigation plans. We're talking about the weather. all sorts of things that could impact a project. That's really active reporting, talking about what could happen and what you're going to do about it, and being really much more on top of things in reporting than just saying, this is what happened in the past month. And the stickiest of all is misrepresented information or skewed information. Now, this can be intentional or it could be unintentional. An example of unintentional problems are internal bias or other sorts of existing bias. And I should have included a slide. I have a great slide on bias that shows the many different kinds of bias that exist in projects and in our own minds. Some are cultural, some are learned. Some may even come from our own education, where we've received sort of a one-sided perspective. I teach a class on agile project management, and I usually spend my entire first 2 weeks of the class trying to convince students that it isn't entirely agile good, everything else bad. And that's coming a lot from their textbooks and their literature that they're reading is, rah agile, but keep saying, there's a place and time for everything. So before you go straight out of your master's degree saying agile good, everything else bad, you might want to get a bit of perspective. I don't want you to walk into a client site and fall flat on your face when they're not all on the same page as you are. Cognitive delusion is another issue where we're so dead set on a number, and we can't get away from it. That can skew information. We like to talk a lot about how consultants and team members are independent or uninfluenced by others. We like to talk about teams that are perhaps have an alliance contract. There's a relationship contract there where we're all together on the same project, even though we're working for different companies. It's a beautiful ideal, but in reality, it's really hard to be independent. It's really, really hard to be that voice of reason on a project. Most people on a team have multiple loyalties. They have loyalties to the project and to the project owner, but they're also being employed by somebody else. So they have obligations to their own employer. They have obligations to their own stakeholders. So true independence is a really hard thing to get on a project. And that tends to show up in very interesting ways in project reporting. You have the classic case of the optimistic project manager who might not report a cost overrun or a schedule overrun in a particular week because they're absolutely certain it's going to be fixed this week or next week, and they don't want to upset the client. That's great for the first week. When you get 6 months down the line and you suddenly have to tell the client that everything's gone utterly tits up, it's a bad look for everybody. So as nice as it is for me to sit here and say, yep, you should just suck it up and tell the truth, I absolutely understand why that does not always happen, and how badly it can go if it carries on too long. Selective reporting also. It's just like the optimism, choosing what to report or what not to report, choosing perhaps to put a little bit of spin on things. It happens all the time. It is very often an intentional choice by the project team, and when it is discovered, it's a very bad look. It's the sort of thing that can be seized on by the media and be broadcast all over the place. It can lead to all sorts of trouble for your own company, for the project owner, and so on. So these are things that you need to be very aware of. When you're talking about forecasting and when you're talking about risk, you're very often dependent on expert opinion. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never been able successfully to calibrate an expert. Experts are what they are. They speak with hopefully decades of experience and insight that the rest of us might be lacking. But in the end, unless you can, follow the maths, expert opinion is exactly that. It's an opinion. So it may be optimistic. It may be actually pessimistic, depending on your expert. and it definitely might come with a huge side of bias. So expert opinion, we all rely on it. We all need it, certainly, in terms of forecasting and risk management, but it needs to be taken with a grain of salt, and it certainly helps if there's plenty of data to back up whatever your expert is saying. If they're using a model or anything else along those lines. So these are the sort of issues that can come up, and very typically in terms of information that is somehow skewed. A lot of it, again, is decisions made on the fly in the heat of the moment by somebody high up on a project team saying, no, don't show that information to the client at this time. I remember being a very enthusiastic junior project team member, very, very happy about the data I had and how much of it there was. And that's how I learned very quickly that executive summaries are what people want.
Absolutely.
They want the 3 or 4 lines. They don't want the 10 pages of the model you're extremely enthusiastic about. I have also learned, being head of project controls on projects, that I have occasionally put together reports and then had the project executives say, no, we're not presenting, that dismal forecast to the project owner at this time. It takes a certain... It takes a certain amount of privilege to be able to stand up to that voice on a project, and it is the rare team member that is able to stand up to a very powerful stakeholder or project executive who is saying that they want information on a project to be withheld. So I would not be surprised if everybody at some point comes across a problem of being told not to release certain information or not to produce certain information to stakeholders. So that's something to be aware of. It helps to be able to sort of have a good heart-to-heart with yourself regarding what you're willing to do for a project and what you're not willing to do. And where the project team or the project reporting trends that you're seeing jive with what you're comfortable with in terms of your own ethics and what you can live with. Let's see. Oops, and that's it for me. So the book is available on Amazon and also through the publishers at Routledge and also certainly plenty of other places. It's available in hardcover and in Kindle form. I've been told it's very useful for sorting out a wobbly table. Depending on how wobbly your table is. And also you have some contact information there. Let's see, stop share. There we go. Yeah. I am going to stop the share of the slides there. Adrienne has a copy of the slide deck, so that can be shared to anybody that wants it. And I am more than happy to answer questions. I see something there under Q&A. So
yeah. So we'll go through the questions, but and if you're tuned in live and you have questions for Alexia, please do type them in either to the Q&A box or the chat window, depending on what device you're tuned in on. I see they've stayed quiet, Alexia.
They have stayed quiet. Thing 1 and Thing 2 are both completely out cold. As one of my these dogs actually do go to conferences, and they've been known to fall dead asleep behind the podium or on the stage. As one of my colleagues said, they've heard all my BS before.
Fantastic.
Oh, you're awake now. Uh-huh.
But no, so Alexia, as you were talking about that situation you were in where you were being asked to, or where we get under a pressure to not report things. It reminds me of a situation where I was doing it was like an executive A3 type dashboard report for a project or program, but it was I was doing it as a lead business analyst at the time, and one of the things that it had on there was top 3 risks, and I put the top 3 risks, and one of the senior execs said, "I don't want that risk on there, take it off." And I remember saying, "But it's a risk," and he said, "Yes, but I don't want the sponsor to see that, you know." And I said, "No," I said, "it stays on." I said, "You can have the conversation with him about about why you think it's not relevant, but from my perspective, it's a risk." And the thing I remember is it created real tension for a short period, but I could sleep at night.
Right.
And that's the one time in my career I genuinely thought I might have been fired. Like I thought there was a chance that it could happen. I thought it was small, but I thought it could happen. But actually, long term, I look back on that and think that was a defining moment, because that was me saying, no, that's an ethical boundary I won't cross. You can prove to me it's not a risk, fine. But if you agree it's a risk, then it goes on there. But anyway, right, we will go through some of the Q&A. So the first question is, could you please advise whether you are suggesting any cost reporting format, for example, a specific template that you were recommending for international stakeholders? So I think the essence of that question is around any particular formats or templates for cost reporting.
I get that question so often. Part of the reason why I wrote the book. There's again, even within a particular category of reports, there is no one-size-fits-all format. So in the book itself, I have taken care to provide not just one example of types of project reports, but 3 or 4 examples. So there could be 4 examples of project dashboards. There could be 4 examples of a cost report. Typically on a cost report, you would want to see the amount that is budgeted, the amount that has been expended, and the amount that is forecasted total to be expended. So you would have an estimate at completion for each line item. And depending on the sort of project you have, you might have those costs broken down, wow, that's new, broken down in more detail by discipline, or by consultant or contractor, or by other categories as fits your sort of project. I have even seen on manufacturing projects done by product line.
Wow.
Yeah, that was fun. So you can roll up projects to a summary level, or project reports, or expand the cost report down into as much detail as you want. It all depends on how you have coded the particular system that you're using. I know that the most popular software used for project cost reporting is Microsoft Excel. So it's not so much coding as how many lines you've wanted to add to your report and whether or not you've checked the maths. But typically it's amount budgeted, amount expended, amount forecasted. That's pretty simple. Again, in the book, you'll see multiple layouts and examples of actual project reports. So I have the examples provided in the book come from 4 or 5 different major software companies, and they've provided examples of actual sanitized reports. So you can see the sort of variety that's out there, and there is a lot of it.
Fantastic. So some real life sanitized examples that we can use as inspiration. So, okay, so the next question is around enterprise project management software. So you mentioned you mentioned getting data from enterprise project management software. Have you ever found a system that has data you can trust? That's a leading question. I like it. I like it though.
Data you can trust. I could do a whole nother presentation on that one. Some of the challenges. So the specific question is ERM or ERP software, which might not be the same as project management or project control software. ERM and ERP systems were originally conceived for organizations, so for business management. They very often center around finance and around the sort of things you would have in a business, like timesheets and expenses, your procurement systems, these sorts of things. They might not always lend themselves well to project management reporting, although a number of ERM and ERP systems do have project management modules that you can purchase and add on to the system. Again, with varying degrees of effectiveness, depending on the sort of project you have. So for certain industries, it might work well. A lot of my experience is in construction. We find we want more information often than what the systems can provide. As far as data you can trust, a deep dive into where that data is coming from, how often it is entered, whether it's been validated. I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. I've seen all of it, so it's really a matter. I have done not just project audits and program audits and organizational and process type audits, but also I have been asked to audit systems.
Wow.
So I had one client ask me to audit their asset management system.
Okay. Wow.
So talking about data you trust, right? It required running amok all over their facilities and looking at assets, and then
a physical asset.
Yep. And then trying to go into the system and see if it was all there. It turns out only 60% of the assets were in the system.
Wow. Wow.
So it can't hurt to validate your own ERM system and figure out when information is put in, how often it's put in, who put it in.
Yeah. So recency, trustworthiness,
yes.
Validation is what we're talking about, I think. So a challenge. So fantastic. Okay, so our next question is, hi, thank you for your talk. I wanted to go back to how you mentioned that timeliness is important. I understand this especially for decision making by stakeholders, but what about the problem of issue fatigue? So what I'm interpreting that question is probably around, I guess too much information can become a problem as well, and fatigue in the issue itself.
I think actually you've answered it right there. The amount of information that stakeholders need to receive, how risk averse and change averse they might be, how tolerant they might be. Not all stakeholders are as risk tolerant as the rest of us. So issue fatigue can definitely be a problem. It's a matter of knowing your stakeholder and forming a good relationship with them, and knowing how best to get information to them.
So it comes back to that building rapport with the stakeholder, understanding their risk appetite, their communication preferences, all the softer stuff that underpins so much of what we do.
Right.
Fantastic. Okay. So next question. Love your thoughts, very relevant at present. I'm looking for an elegant way to put data about projects into one place from which the relevant parts of data could be pulled by the appropriate people. Do you think this could work?
Ooh. It can work. What you're talking about are access controls to a database or a project management system or an ERP system. This was this actually got a lot of press in the early 1980s in the form of executive reporting systems, because executives would get frustrated with always having to go get somebody to get the information they wanted. And so you would have a high-level executive saying, why can't I just log in myself and push a button and get it? It can be done. It can be done well. But again, what you're talking about is creating controls and working with your IT people to ensure that different stakeholders can access the information they need, but not access information they don't need. And also define whether or not they have read and write capabilities or just read.
Yes, yes. and I suppose it's also important that they know any pre-existing limitations of that data. So, you know, I often think like the triangulation of data from various places. I remember, well, you know, you see situations where there's a date which is recorded as sale date, but on different systems, the sale date refers to different things. It can refer to the order date, the dispatch date, the date the payment cleared, and those can skew the data. So I suppose having that open, transparent conversation about how accurate the data can be.
And as much as perhaps the project team loves to say horrible things about stakeholders, it's very possible to get an intelligent, educated, highly capable stakeholder who just loves to get their hands dirty in the project system, compared to, you know, one that perhaps likes to get their hands dirty in the project system and turn it on its ear, which can happen. So again, access controls and whether or not they get read-write capabilities are what you're talking about there.
Absolutely.
It can be done.
Okay, good. So our next question, the question is, do we require a different format of reporting for agile versus hybrid versus waterfall projects?
Yes, there are definitely some very traditionally agile reports. You could have your gosh, I would I would go back to the slides that I had earlier. I do have an entire section in the book that specifically mentions agile reporting and the sort of reports that come out. But also I've actually, in the course of putting this book together, become a bit of a fan of certain sorts of agile reports, because in waterfall type projects, we tend to get sort of the executive summary, a discussion of status, a discussion of cost, one of schedule. You know, if I'm talking about construction projects, bunch of photos, you know, weekly sort of reports from the contractor, stuff like that. But if you look at agile, it's very much more of the moment. And so I have actually suggested to waterfall and hybrid type clients that they use what in agile would be known as a progress plans and problems report. Very succinct, to the point. Here's what we've achieved. Here's what's coming up. Here's what we foresee that's going to be a stumbling block. Boom, let's move on. So there are traditional agile reports such as burn down and cycle time and cumulative flow. They might be appropriate for other sorts of projects, especially, as I said, that progress plans and problems or the A3 type report could be useful almost anywhere. In fact, I actually, one of my students with an astounding degree of success has used it to manage her children and her husband.
Wow.
In the household.
That's quite an achievement.
Which really cracked me up. But anyway, so yeah, there are some that are more traditional, depending on the sort of project structure you have. But really, it comes down to what your stakeholders need to see.
Fantastic, fantastic. Okay, so our next question is about buying the book. The question is, thanks for such a wonderful insight on reporting. I just checked the book at amazon.ca and it says the title is not currently available for purchase. Any tips?
Well, I need to go yell at my publisher. Thank you very much. And in the meantime, I would suggest going to routledge.com, or indeed go ahead and just search, just type the project title into Google and see what comes up. If it's .ca, that's Canada. It may well be available somewhere else. I do know that it's available through multiple locations online. But if all else fails, Routledge, Taylor and Francis Group also has it, and you can hopefully get it from there.
But you know, I guess if we look at that, you're a sold out author. You've sold out the Canadian stock of the book.
I wish. It's actually an on-demand printing.
Okay.
So there's no such thing as sold out. But yes, I had not actually checked on Amazon in California. Canada. Oh my God. In Canada, but I will have a chat with my publisher.
Fantastic. And final question that we have the opportunity to cover today is, what is your recommendation regarding the combination of automatically gathered data and manually added data or corrections? Quite a big question to finish on.
Again, that's really another sort of can of snakes. I would say that in this day and age, there is still a certain amount of information that is gathered on paper that needs to be entered into a project system, or force-fed into an Excel spreadsheet, or beaten up in some fashion. We are moving towards more automatic data collection. And we're getting a lot of this in terms of smart cities, sort of data collection from all sorts of different sources that go automatically into a database. But those also produce their own types of problems. There's a matter of cleaning up data and having the good sense to know what might be garbage information that has come through an automatic system. So I think at the moment we're all kind of stuck with a hybrid. There's nothing particularly optimal about it. It's a matter of the data that your stakeholders need to receive and how you are able to get your hands on it and get it into the report. But we are ideally moving perhaps towards a universe that could be, I won't say it's in this decade because I think it's still too sticky, but we could conceivably end up in a world where data is automatically tracked and captured. We're just not there right now.
And we're not ready to get rid of Excel. We can't let it go just yet.
We just can't. Yeah. And the last chapter of the book does talk about data analytics, intelligent computing, and so on. Intelligent computing, and so on and so forth. And it talks about where the future could be headed. A lot of that has to do with, again, modeling and the problems of garbage in, garbage out.
Fantastic. So, Alexia, thank you so much for taking the time this evening. I mean, it's been a fascinating, a really, really useful presentation. I'm sure we'll all be off to get copies of the book. I've had someone say it's definitely available in the UK, so that's a good sign.
Well, I should hope so, since it's a British publisher.
Right, good. So I'm sure people will also want to follow you and stay in touch. So in terms of social media, is it good for people to connect on LinkedIn or Twitter? How should people follow you?
Absolutely. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. I am Rough H2O, or Rough Water, on Twitter. And I also have my own website, which is Pellucid Projects.
Fantastic. And what I'll do, there'll be an email that goes out to folks after this, so I'll just put those links on there in case they want to follow you, and of course I'll put a link to the book in there as well. So fantastic. Well, all that's left for me to do just before we finish is, as a reminder, this this webinar series was really started as a bit of a sort of BA community series, really, to get people in the BA community talking about topics that we perhaps don't talk about enough. And so if you're tuned in live, or indeed if you're watching the recording and there's a topic that you think we should be covering, please get in touch. We can probably make it happen. So all that's left for me to say again is, Alexia, thank you very much for taking the time to come and present to us this evening, and thank you to everyone who tuned in, and indeed everyone who's watching the recording. So see you again soon.